from the News Channel 5 Network. This is OpenLine.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being with us for OpenLine. I'm Carrie Sharp. Tonight we're talking about human trafficking and what that looks like here in the mid-state and how the state as a whole is doing at supporting survivors of human trafficking. I have a wonderful guest joining me tonight who knows all the ins and outs of this and everything in between. Margie Quinn is joining us. She spent 26 years in law enforcement, now the CEO of End Slavery Tennessee. Margie, thank you for being back with us.
Thank you so much. It's always great to be on OpenLine.
Well, we always learn so much, and I just want to start with the very basics. So we're all on the same page here of what exactly is human trafficking, because I think a lot of people have different ideas of what this looks like.
Yeah, that's a great question, because domestic human trafficking doesn't always look like international human trafficking. And I think sometimes people are a little confused about what that is here in the United States. And so the TVPA, which is the Trafficking for Victims Protection Act, passed the United States Congress in 2000. And then our state statute came along a few years later in 2007, and they sort of mirror each other. And what those laws say is that when a person engages in a commercial sex act, is over 18 by means of force, fraud, or coercion, that is human trafficking. And so you have a person over the age of 18, a commercial sex act occurs, and that is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. When the person is under the age of 18, the government proves that a sex act occurred that was commercial, a commercial sex act. We don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion with a minor, and so that is human trafficking. And so I think it's also, I think, a really good distinction, and it's always good to point out that a buyer can be a trafficker under our state statute if they are buying somebody that they know is under the age of 18. And so a lot of times you see a lot of these sting operations, and you see a lot of these buyers being arrested, and I'm sure people are thinking, well, that's kind of strange. But we understand that the crime of human trafficking doesn't occur at all if there is no buyer. And so the penalties for buying a child, a person under the age of 18, are going to be very strict, and they're going to be the same as a promoter of trafficking.
And actually, you mentioned these things, and just in the last month, this month, we've reported on 4, I believe we're up to now, from the TBI. They join usually with local law enforcement in whatever area of the state they're in. 4 in 1 month, at a month that's not even over yet. What's going on from your perspective? And from my perspective, that seems like a lot in 1 month. What would prompt that?
I think there are a couple of things going on. One is coming out of COVID. I think, we were unable, I think, on the law enforcement side to be as active as they probably wanted to be. I also think that the TBI has formed up a statewide task force, and they have been able to bring on local officers into a task force, and that force multiplies. And so they're able to run more of these operations with more manpower. The TBI in 2015 received 4 additional special agents to just work trafficking across the state, but that was only 4, and they covered the entire state.
Wow.
So clearly manpower was an issue, and so being able to plus up with local officers both helps, I think, local police departments, as well as it kind of show the state exactly how much trafficking is going on here. And I give them a lot of credit. I'm very, very pleased to see this uptick in activity from law enforcement, because every time that we identify a victim on the enforcement side, that's a victim that we get to offer services to and potentially work towards healing with on the victim services side.
And I do want to talk about the victim side of it a lot. I also, as we talk about the stings, I want to know from your perspective, when these stings hit the news and we say, 10 people were arrested, they are usually men, does it work as a deterrent?
I think if you do them often enough, and the risk of arrest or the risk of exposure increases, because you think about 5-7 years ago, there weren't any of these things being operated across the state of Tennessee, and so the likelihood that a person would get caught buying either an adult or a child was minimal. And so you got to think this was a really high reward crime and a really low risk. And so if we want to try to get our hands around this, we've got to upend that. We've got to make this a high risk, low reward crime. And so if you increase the penalties, make this a really risky crime, and the likelihood that you're going to get caught increases, then you're starting to talk about a potential deterrent, because at least most of the men that I saw coming through the operations that I was a part of at TBI, many of these men had families, had wives, had children, had good jobs, and they have a lot to lose. And so by increasing the risk, many of those men, we hope, will begin to think this is just too risky a behavior to engage in. Now, I would probably argue that they need some sort of help and treatment, because they really shouldn't be doing that to begin with. But really what we want to do is try to change behavior, and increasing the risk associated with the crime could certainly do that in this particular type of crime.
When I was a reporter in Louisville, gosh, 15, 20 years ago now, I used to sit in arraignment court in the morning. That was part of my beat. And we would see a lot of men come through who had been arrested the previous night for prostitution, or for, soliciting a prostitute. We don't hear much on those charges anymore about the prostitution lingo. Has that been replaced with human trafficking? And has it been a difference in how we look and prosecute these things now?
Yeah, I think so. That's a great question. And I think the more we understand about sort of the life or the game, as it's referred to, we start to understand that prostitution and trafficking, there's a very fine line between those two things. And you have to really understand that prostitution is an inherently violent crime. It's just incredibly violent. Many of the women that we serve, about 68%, are opioid addicted. Of course, drug addiction makes a person extremely vulnerable to a crime like trafficking. Mental health issues, poverty, early childhood sexual abuse that was never treated. All of these things make a victim, susceptible to additional victimization as they age. And so kind of understanding that phenomenon, I think, has created something where police, I think, are looking at women who are in prostitution very differently, asking a lot of different types of questions. And you can see the result of all that training that's been happening in the state, that mandatory law enforcement training, because we're seeing 65% fewer arrests for prostitution in our state since 2014. And so I think we have changed our focus in the state to looking at buyers and promoters, and decreased our focus on women who many times and are often the victims of this type of crime.
And as you are leading us down this road, I do want to kind of switch our perspective and talk about the victims/survivors of human trafficking. And we'll start with what End Slavery Tennessee does. So give me the fine points of what you guys are doing.
Yeah, let me give you the pitch. We're about a 10-year-old agency. We'll celebrate our 10th birthday next March. The agency started in sort of kind of education and awareness by our founder, Derry Smith, and she created a lot of relationships around the state, did a lot of education and raising awareness. In about 2014, she started serving victims of trafficking. And so we are now an agency, I think, primarily dedicated to serving survivors of human trafficking. And those are survivors who've been trafficked either into or out of the state of Tennessee. Most of them are native Tennesseans. And we concentrate on sort of the 41 counties of Middle Tennessee. So we kind of operate from Kentucky to Alabama, kind of straight down the middle of the state. And there are 4 areas, though, that we really concentrate in, and that's training. And we've got great training on our website. We are training all public school educators in the state of Tennessee by state law. That was a state law that was passed 3 years ago. We are training now all of Tennessee's correctional professionals, and that training is sitting on our website. It's great new training. We just put it up about a month ago. And we are training all of the teens and tweens through programming in the public schools, and that's also on our website. Advocacy work, so we're doing a lot of policy work. a lot of work with Shared Hope, a lot of work with the legislature, try to create a great framework from which to respond to this kind of crime. We do aftercare, obviously. We're serving, we're getting about between 200 and 300 referrals every year for services here in Middle Tennessee. 307 in 2019, about 170 in the pandemic year. And I looked last week, and I think we were about 230 referrals this year. So we're kind of creeping back up to that 300 referral level. And then the last thing we do is prevention. And prevention, as many would argue, that is the kind of most important thing that we're doing. And so we have a great relationship with the Department of Children's Services and the juvenile courts. And when children are identified engaging in high-risk behavior that we think would lead them down the road to potential exploitation, we can come in and execute like a 12-week program with them, a one-on-one prevention program, evidence-based program, and that's been very successful as well. So those are really the 4 key areas that we're working on here in Middle Tennessee.
That's a big job ahead of you. We have a lot more to talk about in this hour of Open Line, and I also want to invite you at home to call in and ask Margie any questions you might have about this. I know that she'll be able to answer them. Number is on the screen, 615-737+. We'll be right back.